Oh, before I start though, big round, medium round, small round, small round, medium round, medium round. All of them. I can see the moon. Right, there's 2 votes for medium. 2 for medium, 3 for medium. Looks like medium have got it. That's 3-1 for little. Oh, is there genuinely a poll active? Oh, amazing. Thank you, Mission Control. Very grateful. Small, medium, the other ones. So that's the big ones have got 4 votes. Small have got 3 votes. Medium, which was popular in the chat, has got no votes. How interesting. That's interesting, because chat called out medium, but they then didn't go on to vote for it. Excellent. Multiple votes are active, apparently. Small, I've got 12 votes. A medium, 11. And the other one's 15. Medium now up to 24. Medium finally won in the end. There you go. And that is democracy. Now, I don't look at the chat until after the story. I haven't read this story. Let's hope it's not racist. Please don't go. I've missed you. Hello, and welcome to Armchair Readings, read live and cold, I've not read this before, on Twitch on Monday nights at 9 p.m. Come and join us live. Now I'm going to show you the cover of this book, but it does contain a spider. So if you don't want to see the spider, look away now. 65 Great Spine Chillers. Edited by Mary Danby. Authors include Stephen King. And tonight's story is from Stephen King. You can look back at the screen now. The spider has gone. From the front of the book, anyway. Just don't look up into the corner of your room. Suffer the Little Children by Stephen King. Miss Sidley was her name, and teaching was her game. She was a small woman who had to reach on tiptoes to write on the highest level of the blackboard, which she was doing now. Behind her, none of the children giggled or whispered, or munched on secret sweets held in cupped hands. They knew Miss Sidley too well. Miss Sidley knew instinctively who was chewing gum at the back of the room, who had a bean shooter in his pocket, who wanted to go to the bathroom to trade baseball cards rather than use the facilities. Like God, she seemed to know everything all at once. She was greying, and the brace she wore to support her failing back was lined clearly against her print dress. Small, constantly suffering, gimlet-eyed woman. But they feared her. Her tongue was a schoolyard legend. The eyes, when turned on a giggler or a whisperer, could turn the stoutest knees to water. Now, writing the day's list of spelling words on the slate, she reflected that the success of her long teaching career could be summed and checked and proven by this one daily action. She could turn her back on her pupils in confidence. Vacation, she said, pronouncing the word as she wrote it in her firm, no-nonsense script. Edward, will you please use the word vacation in a sentence? I went on vacation to New York City, Edward piped. Then, as Miss Sidley talked, he repeated the word carefully. Vacation. Very good, Edward. She began the next word. She had her little tricks, of course. Success, she firmly believed, depended as much upon taking note of little things as it did upon the big ones. She applied the principle constantly in the classroom, and it never failed. Jane, she said quietly. Jane, who had been furtively perusing her reader, looked up guiltily. Close that book now, please. The book shut. Jane looked pale, hating eyes at Miss Sidley's back. And you will stay for 15 minutes after the final bell. Jane's lips trembled. Yes, Miss Sidley. One of her little tricks was the careful use of her glasses. The whole class was reflected to her in her thick lenses, and she had always been thinly amused by their guilty, frightened faces when she caught them at their nasty little games. Now she saw a phantomish, distorted Robert in the front row wrinkle his nose. She did not speak. Robert would hang himself if given a little more rope. Tomorrow, she pronounced clearly. Robert, will you please use the word tomorrow in a sentence? Robert frowned over the problem. The classroom was hushed and sleepy in the late September sun. The electric clock over the door buzzed a rumour of 3 o'clock dismal just a half-hour away, and the only thing that kept young heads from drowsing over their spellers was the silent, ominous threat of Miss Sidley's back. I am waiting, Robert. Tomorrow a bad thing will happen, Robert said. The words were perfectly innocuous, but Miss Sidley, with the seventh sense that all strict disciplinarians have, could sense a double meaning. Tomorrow, Robert finished. His hands were folded neatly on the desk, and he wrinkled his nose again. He smiled a tiny side-of-the-mouth smile. Miss Sidley was suddenly unaccountably sure Robert knew her little trick with the glasses. Very well. She began to write the next word with no comment of commendation for Robert, letting her straight body speak its own message. She watched carefully with one eye. Soon Robert would stick out his tongue or make that disgusting finger gesture, just to see if she really knew what he was doing. Then he would be punished. The reflection was small, ghostly and distorted, and she had all but the barest corner of her eye on the word she was writing. Robert changed. She caught just a corner of it, just a frightening glimpse of Robert's face changing into something different. She whirled round, face white, barely noticing the protesting stab of pain in her back. Robert looked at her blandly, questioningly. His hands were neatly folded. The first signs of an afternoon cowlick showed at the back of his head. He did not look frightened. I have imagined it, she thought. I was looking for something, and then there was nothing. I just made something up. However, Robert, she asked. She had meant to be authoritative, the unspoken demand for confession. It did not come out that way. Yes, Miss Sidley? His eyes were a very dark brown, like the mud at the bottom of a slow-running stream. Nothing. She turned her back to the board, and a little whisper ran through the class. "Be quiet!" Her voice snapped. She turned again and faced them. "Another sound, and we will all stay after school with Jane." She addressed the whole class, but looked particularly at Robert, and he looked back with a childlike, "I didn't do it," innocence. She turned to the board and began to write, not looking out of the corners of her glasses. The last half hour dragged, and it seemed that Robert gave her a strange look on the way out, a look that said, "We have a secret, don't we?" It wouldn't get out of her mind. It seemed to be stuck like a tiny string of roast beef between molars. A small thing, actually, but a feeling as big as a cinder block. She sat down on her solitary dinner at 5 poached eggs on toast, still thinking about it. She knew she was getting older and accepted the knowledge calmly. She was not going to be one of those old lady school teachers dragged kicking and screaming from their classrooms at the age of retirement. They reminded her of gamblers emotionally unable to leave the table while they were losing. But she was not losing. She had always been a winner. She looked down at her poached egg. Hadn't she? She thought of the well-scrubbed faces in the 3rd grade classroom and found Robert's face superimposed over them. She got up and switched on a light. Later, just before dropping off to sleep, Robert's face floated in front of her, smiling unpleasantly in the darkness behind her lids. The face began to change. But before she saw exactly what it was changing into, she dropped off to sleep. Miss Sidley spent an unrestful night, and the next day her temper was short. She waited, almost hoped for a whisperer, a giggler, or perhaps even a note passer, but the class was quiet, very quiet. They all stared at her unresponsively, and seemed that she could feel the weight of their eyes on her like blind, crawling ants. "Now stop," she told herself sternly. She paused, controlling an urge to bite her lip. She was acting like a skittish girl just out of seminary. Again the dame seemed to drag, and she believed she was more relieved than her charges when the dismal bell rang. The children lined up in orderly rows at the doors, boys and girls by height, hands dutifully linked. "Dismissed," she said, and listened sourly as they shrieked down the hall and into the bright sunlight. What was it? It was bulbous. It shimmered, and it changed, and it stared at me. Yes, stared and grinned. It wasn't a child at all. It was old, and it was evil, and "Miss Sidley!" Her hand jerked up a little. "Oh!" hiccuped involuntarily from her throat. It was Mr. Hanning. He smiled apologetically. "Didn't mean to disturb you." "Quite all right," she said, more curtly than she had intended. What was she thinking? What was wrong with her? "Would you mind checking the paper towels in the girls' lavatory?" "Surely." She got up, placing her hands against the small of her back. Mr. Hanning looked at her sympathetically. Save it, she thought. The old maid is not amused, or even interested. She brushed by Mr. Hanning and started down the hall to the girls' lavatory. A capering group of small boys carrying scratched and pitted baseball equipment grew silent at the sight of her and leaked out the door, where their cries began again. Miss Sidley looked after them resentfully, reflecting that children had been different in her day, not more polite. Children have never had time for that, not exactly more respectful for their elders. It was a kind of hypocrisy that had never been there before, a smiling quietness around adults that had never been there before, a kind of quiet contempt that was upsetting and unnerving, as if they were hiding behind masks. She pushed the thought away and went into the lavatory. It was a small tiled room with frosted glass windows shaped like an L. The toilets were ranged along one bar and sinks along both sides of the shorter bar. As she checked along the paper towel container, she caught a glimpse of her face in one of the mirrors and was startled into looking at it more closely. God! There was a look that hadn't been there 2 days ago, a frightened, watching look. With sudden shock, she realised that the tiny blurred reflection in her glasses, coupled with Robert's pale, respectful face, had gotten inside her and was festering. The door opened, and she heard two girls come in, giggling secretly about something. She was about to turn the corner and walk past out when she heard her own name. She turned back to the wash bowls and began checking the towel holders again. And then soft giggles, she knows, but more giggles, soft and sticky as melting soap. Miss Sidley is... Stop it! Stop that noise! By moving slightly, she could see their shadows, made fuzzy and ill-defined by the diffused lighting filtered through the frosted windows, holding on to each other with girlish glee. Another thought she called up out of her mind. They knew she was there. Yes, they did, the little bitches. They knew. She would shake them until their teeth rattled and their giggles turned to wails, and she would make them admit that they knew. The shadows changed. They seemed to elongate, to flow like dripping tallow, taking on a strange, hunched shape that made Miss Sidley cringe back against the porcelain washstands, her heart swelling in her chest. They went on giggling. The voice changed, no longer girlish, now sexless and soulless and quite evil. A slow, turgid sound of mindless humour that flowed around the corner, to her, like a river mud. She stared at the hunched shadows and suddenly screamed at them. The scream went on and on, swelling in her head until it attained a pitch of lunacy, and then she fainted. The giggling, like the laughter of demons, followed her down into the darkness. She could not, of course, tell them the truth. Miss Sidley knew this even as she opened her eyes and looked up at the anxious face of Mr. Hanning and Mrs. Crossan. Mrs. Crossan was holding a little bottle of sharp-smelling stuff under her nose. Mr. Hanning turned around and told the two little girls, who were looking curiously at Miss Sidley, to go on home now, please. They both smiled at her, slow, "We have a secret" smiles, and went out. Very well. She would keep their secret for a while. She would not have people thinking her insane. She would not have them thinking that the first feelers of senility had touched her early. She would play their game until she could expose their nastiness and rip it out by the roots. "I'm afraid I slipped," she said, calmly, sitting up and ignoring the excruciating pain in her back. "A patch of wetness." "This is awful," Mr. Hanning said. "Terrible. Did you hurt your back, Emily?" Mrs. Crossan interrupted. Mr. Hanning looked at her gratefully. Miss Sidley got up, her spine screaming in her body. "No," she said. "In fact, something seems to have snapped back into place. It actually feels better." "We can send for..." Mr. Hanning began. "No physician necessary. I'll just go on home." Miss Sidley smiled at him coolly. "I'll get you a taxi." "I always take the bus," Miss Sidley said. She walked out. Mr. Hanning sighed and looked at Mrs. Crossan. "She does seem more like herself." The next day, Miss Sidley kept Robert after school. He did nothing. She just simply accused him. Falsely. She felt no qualms. He was a monster, not a little boy, and she would make him admit it. Her back was in agony. She realised Robert knew. He expected that would help him, but it wouldn't. That was another of her little advantages. Her back had been in constant pain to her for the last 12 years. And there had been times when it had been this bad, well, almost as bad as this. She closed the door, shutting the two of them in. For a moment she stood still, training her gaze on Robert. She waited for him to drop his eyes. He didn't. He gazed back at her. Presently a little smile began to play around the corners of his mouth. "Why are you smiling, Robert?" she asked softly. "I don't know," Robert went on smiling. "Tell me, please, Robert." Robert said nothing. He went on smiling. The outside sounds of children at play were far off, distant, dreamy. Only the hypnotic buzz of the wall clock was real. "There's quite a few of us," Robert said suddenly, as if he were commenting on the weather. It was Miss Sidley's turn to be silent. 11. Right here. In school. Robert went on smiling his small smile. Quite evil, she thought. Amazed. Very incredibly evil. Please don't lie, she said clearly. Lies only make things worse. Robert's smile grew wider. It became vulpine. Do you want to see me change, Miss Sidley? He asked. Would you like to see it right now? Miss Sidley felt a nameless chill. Go away, she said curtly, and bring your mother and father to school with you tomorrow. We'll get this business straightened out. There, on solid ground again. She waited for his face to crumble, waited for the tears and the pleas to relent. Robert's smile grew wider. He showed his teeth. It will just be like show and tell, won't it, Miss Sidley? Robert, the other Robert, he liked show and tell. He's still hiding way down in my head. The smile curled at the corner of his mouth like charring paper. Sometimes he runs around. It itches. He wants me to let him out. Go away, Miss Sidley said numbly. The buzzing of the clock seemed very loud. Robert changed. His face suddenly ran together like melting wax, his eyes flattening and spreading like knife-struck egg yolks, nose widening and yawning, mouth disappearing, the head elongated, and the hair was suddenly not hair, but straggling, twitching growths. Robert began to chuckle. The slow, cavernous sound came from what had been his nose, but the nose was eating into the lower half of his face, nostrils meeting and merging into a central blackness, like a huge, shouting mouth. Robert got up, still chuckling, and behind it all she could see the last shattered remains of the other Robert, howling in manic terror, screeching to be let out. She ran. She fled, screaming down the corridor. The few late-leaving pupils turned to look at her with large, uncomprehending eyes. Mr. Hanning jerked open his door and looked out, just as Miss Sidley plunged through the wide glass front doors, a wild, waving scarecrow silhouetted against the bright September sky. He ran after her, Adam's apple bobbing convulsively. Miss Sidley! Miss Sidley! Robert came out of the classroom and watched, curiously. Miss Sidley neither heard nor saw. She clattered down the walk and across the sidewalk and into the streets, with her screams trailing behind her like banners. There was a huge blatting horn, and then the bus was looming over her, the bus driver's face a plaster mask of fear. Air brakes whined and hissed like dragons in flight. Miss Sidley fell, and the huge wheels shuddered to a smoking stop just 8 inches from her frail, brace-armoured body. She lay shuddering on the pavement, hearing the crowd gather around her. She turned over, and the children were staring down at her. They were ringed in a tight little circle like mourners around an open grave, and at the head of the grave was Robert, his little face sober and solemn, ready to read the death rites and shovel the first spade of dirt over her face. From far away, the bus driver's shaken babble. Crazy or something. My God, another half a foot. The Miss Sidley stared numbly at the children. Their shadows covered her and blocked out the sun. Their faces were impassive. Some of them were smiling little secret smiles. And Miss Sidley knew that soon she would begin to scream again. Then Mr. Hanning broke their tight noose and shooed them away. Miss Sidley began to sob weakly. She did not go back to her 3rd grade for a month. She told Mr. Hanning calmly that she had not been feeling herself, and Mr. Hanning suggested that she go to a reputable doctor and discuss the matter with him. Miss Sidley agreed that this was only sensible and rational, of course. She also said that if the school board wished her resignation, she would tender it immediately, although it would hurt her very much. Mr. Hanning, looking uncomfortable, said he doubted if it would be necessary. The upshot of the matter was that Miss Sidley went back to her class in late October, once again ready to play the game, and now knowing how to play it. For the first week, she let things go on as ever. It seemed the whole class now regarded her with hostile, shielded eyes. Robert smiled distantly at her from his front row seat, and she did not have the courage to take him to task. Once, while on playground duty, Robert walked over to her, holding a dodgem ball, smiling. "There's more of us now. Lots more." A girl on the jungle gym looked across the playground at them and smiled, as if she had heard. Miss Sidley smiled serenely, refusing to remember the face-changing, mutating. "Why, Robert? Whatever do you mean?" But Robert only continued smiling and went back to his game. Miss Sidley knew the time had come. She brought the gun to school in her handbag. It had been her brother Jim's. He had taken it from a dead German shortly after the Battle of the Bulge. Jim had been gone 10 years now. She had not opened the box that held the gun in more years than that. But when she did it, it was still there, gleaming dully. The 4 clips of shells were still in the box too, and she loaded carefully the way Jim had showed her once. She smiled pleasantly at her class, at Robert in particular. Robert smiled back, and she could see the murky alienness swimming just below his skin, muddy, full of filth. She never cared, wondering just what was impersonating Robert, but she wished she knew if real Robert was still inside. She did not wish to be a murderess. She decided that the real Robert must have died or gone insane living inside this dirty, crawling thing that had chuckled at her in the classroom and sent her screaming into the street. So even if he was still alive, putting him out of his misery would be a mercy. "Today we're going to have a test," Miss Sidley said. The class did not groan or shift apprehensively. They merely looked at her. She could feel their eyes, like weights, heavy, smothering. "It's a very special test. I will call you down to the mimeographing room, one by one, and give you your test. Then you may have a candy and go home for the day. Won't that be nice?" They smiled empty smiles and said nothing. "Robert, will you come first?" Robert got up, smiling a little smile. He wrinkled his nose quite openly at her. "Yes, Miss Sidley." Miss Sidley took her bag and then went down the empty, echoing corridor together, past the sleepy buzz of reciting classes coming from behind closed doors. The mimeograph room was at the far end of the hall, past the lavatories. It had been soundproofed 2 years ago, and the big machine was very old and very noisy. Miss Sidley closed the door behind them and locked it. "No one can hear you," she said calmly. She took the gun from her bag. "You or the gun?" Robert smiled insolently. "There are lots of us, though. Lots more than here." He put one small scrubbed hand on the paper tray of the mimeograph machine. "Would you like to see me change, Miss Sidley?" Before she could speak, the change began. Robert's face began to melt and shimmer into the grotesqueness beneath, and Miss Sidley shot him once in the head. He fell back against the paper-lined shelves and slid down to the floor, a little dead boy with a round black hole above the right eye. He looked very pathetic. Miss Sidley stood over him, breathing hard. Her scrawny cheeks were livid. The huddled figure didn't move. It was human. It was Robert. "No. It was all in your mind, Emily. All in your mind. No. 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 No." She went back up to the room and began to lead them down, one by one. She killed 12 of them. would have killed them all if Mrs. Crossan hadn't come down for a package of composition paper. Mrs. Crossan's eyes got very big. One hand crept up and clutched her mouth. She began to scream. She was still screaming when Miss Sidley reached her and put a hand on her shoulder. "It had to be done," she said sadly to the screaming Mrs. Crossan. "It's terrible, but it had to. They're all monsters. I found out." Mrs. Crossan stared at the gay-clothed little bodies scattered around the mimeograph and continued to scream. The little girl, whose hand Miss Sidley was holding, began to cry steadily and monotonously. "Change," Miss Sidley said. "Change from Mrs. Crossan. Show her it had to be done." The girl continued to weep uncomprehendingly. "Damn you! Change!" Miss Sidley screamed. "Dirty bitch! Dirty, filthy, unnatural bitch! Change, God damn you! Change!" She raised the gun. The little girl cringed. Then Mrs. Crossan was on her like a cat, and Miss Sidley's back gave way. No trial. The paper screamed for a trial. Bereaved parents swore hysterical oaths against Miss Sidley, and the city sat back on its haunches in numb shock. 12 children. The state legislature called for more stringent teacher examination tests. Summer Street School closed for a week of mourning, and Miss Sidney went quietly to an antiseptic madhouse in the next state. She was put in deep analysis, given the most modern drugs, introduced into daily work therapy sessions. A year later, under strictly controlled conditions, Miss Sidley was put in an experimental encounter therapy situation. Buddy Jenkins was his name. Psychiatry was his game. He sat behind a one-way glass with a clipboard, looking into a room which had been outfitted as a nursery. On the far wall, the cow was jumping over the moon, and the mouse was halfway up the clock. Miss Sidley sat in her wheelchair with a storybook, surrounded by a group of soft, trusting, totally mindless children. They smiled at her and drooled and touched her with small, wet fingers, while attendants at the next window watched for the first sign of an aggressive move. For a time, Buddy thought she responded well. She read aloud, stroked a girl's head, picked up a small boy when he fell over a toy block. Then she seemed to see something which disturbed her. A frown creased her brow, and she looked away from the children. "Take me away, please," Miss Sidley said softly and tonelessly to no one in particular. So they took her away. Buddy Jenkins watched the children watch her go, their eyes wide and empty, but somehow deep. One smiled, and another put his fingers to his mouth, slyly. Two little girls clutched each other and giggled. That night, Miss Sidley cut her throat with a bit of broken mirror glass, and Buddy Jenkins began to watch the children. Suffer the Little Children by Stephen King. Oh, that was cheerful, wasn't it? Well then. Blimey, says Barry. Very jolly. Yes, I cut out one word.